The morning sun cast long shadows across the refugee camp in northern Afghanistan. Sarah Martinez wiped sweat from her forehead as she checked the medical supplies in the small clinic tent. As a volunteer doctor with Doctors Without Borders, she had seen her share of difficult situations, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. Sarah had arrived at the camp 3 weeks earlier. The remote location housed nearly 2,000 displaced families who had fled the violence in their villages. Most were women and children, their faces bearing the weight of loss and uncertainty. Despite the challenging conditions, Sarah found purpose in her work. Every day brought new patients, and every life she helped save felt like a small victory against the chaos surrounding them. The camp sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills. The nearest military base was 40 miles away, and communication with the outside world was limited to a single satellite phone. The isolation didn't bother Sarah much. She had volunteered for this assignment specifically because she wanted to help where help was needed most. That particular morning started like any other. Sarah made her rounds, checking on patients in the makeshift hospital ward. An elderly man with diabetes needed his insulin adjusted. A young mother brought her baby, who had developed a fever during the night. A teenage boy had cut his hand while helping to repair a damaged tent. These were the routine cases that filled her days. Around noon, Sarah noticed unusual activity outside the camp perimeter. Local security guards seemed agitated, speaking in hushed tones and gesturing toward the surrounding hills. When she asked Ahmed, the camp coordinator, about the commotion, he assured her it was nothing serious, just reports of increased military activity in the area. But Sarah's instincts told her otherwise. She had learned to read the subtle signs of danger during her months working in conflict zones, the way people avoided eye contact, the nervous energy that seemed to ripple through conversations, the sudden quietness that fell over normally bustling areas. Something was definitely wrong. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the camp grew increasingly tense. Families began gathering their few possessions, whispering among themselves. Some of the local staff members who usually stayed late were packing up early. When Sarah tried to get more information, she was met with evasive answers and worried glances. By evening, Sarah's concerns proved justified. A convoy of armed vehicles approached the camp from the main road. These weren't the familiar uniforms of the international peacekeeping forces or the Afghan military. These men wore different gear and carried themselves with the confidence of those who had come to take rather than protect. The attack began without warning. Explosions rocked the camp as armed militants stormed through the main entrance. Sarah was in the clinic when the first blast shattered windows and sent medical equipment flying. The screams of terrified families filled the air as people ran in every direction, desperate to find safety. Sarah's medical training kicked in immediately. Instead of running, she moved toward the danger, knowing that injured people would need help. She grabbed what medical supplies she could carry and began working her way through the chaos, stopping to help anyone who was hurt. The militants moved systematically through the camp, searching buildings and rounding up anyone they found. Sarah watched in horror as they separated men from women and children, forcing families apart at gunpoint. When they reached the clinic, Sarah was treating a young girl who had been injured by flying debris. "You come with us," one of the militants ordered in broken English, pointing his weapon at Sarah. She looked at the scared faces around her, knowing that leaving meant abandoning people who desperately needed medical care. "I'm a doctor," she said firmly. "These people are injured. They need help." The militant's response was swift and brutal. The butt of his rifle struck Sarah across the head, sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through her skull as darkness crept in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the terrified face of the little girl she had been trying to help. When Sarah regained consciousness, she found herself in a small, dark room that smelled of dampness and decay. Her head throbbed where she had been struck, and dried blood crusted around a gash on her forehead. Her hands were bound behind her back with rough rope that cut into her wrists. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a crack in what appeared to be a concrete wall, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. Several other aid workers sat against the opposite wall, their faces showing various degrees of injury and exhaustion. She recognized 2 of them from the camp, Maria, a nurse from Spain, and David, a water engineer from Canada. "How long have I been unconscious?" Sarah whispered. "About 6 hours," Maria replied quietly. "They brought us here after the attack." We don't know where we are, but we've been driving for hours before they brought us to this place. David leaned forward, his voice barely audible. They took dozens of people from the camp. We heard them talking about demands, about ransoms. They're planning to use us as bargaining chips. Sarah's heart sank as she thought about the families at the camp. Had they escaped? Were they safe? The uncertainty was almost as painful as her physical injuries. She had come to Afghanistan to help people, and now she felt completely helpless. The room they were held in appeared to be part of a larger building, possibly an abandoned warehouse or factory. The walls were thick concrete, and the only opening was a heavy metal door that remained firmly locked. Sarah could hear voices and movement from somewhere beyond the door, but the words were muffled and indistinct. Hours passed slowly. Their captors brought them water once, but no food. The other prisoners shared what little information they had gathered. The militants seemed to be part of a well-organized group with connections to larger terrorist networks. They had attacked the refugee camp not just for the aid workers, but also to send a message to international organizations operating in the region. As night fell, Sarah's thoughts turned to her family back home in Texas. Her parents had worried about her decision to volunteer in Afghanistan, but they had supported her choice to use her medical skills where they were needed most. She wondered if they knew what had happened, if rescue teams were already searching for the missing aid workers. Despite the fear and uncertainty, Sarah felt a spark of determination growing within her. She had survived the initial attack and she was still alive. That meant there was still hope. She began to study every detail of their prison, looking for weaknesses, for opportunities. If rescue didn't come to them, maybe they could find a way to rescue themselves. 3 days had passed since the attack on the refugee camp, and Sarah's situation had grown increasingly desperate. The concrete room where she and 5 other aid workers were being held had become their entire world. The smell of unwashed bodies and fear hung heavy in the stale air, and the single bucket in the corner served as their only sanitation facility. Sarah's medical knowledge became both a blessing and a curse in their captivity. She could assess their physical condition and understand the signs of dehydration and malnutrition that were beginning to affect them all, but she was powerless to do anything about it with her hands bound and no medical supplies available. Maria, the Spanish nurse, had developed a persistent cough that worried Sarah greatly. David, the water engineer, had a deep cut on his arm from the initial attack that was showing signs of infection. Without proper medical care, their conditions would only worsen. Sarah had tried to convince their guards to provide basic medical supplies, but her requests were met with either silence or harsh words in a language she didn't understand. The militants who held them seemed to operate on a strict schedule. Every morning, 2 guards would bring them a small amount of bread and water. Every evening, a different set of guards would check their restraints and occasionally ask questions about their work, their organizations, and their government's policies in the region. Sarah quickly realized that gathering information about their captors was crucial to any hope of survival or escape. She observed that the guards rotated in 12-hour shifts, and there seemed to be at least 8 different men involved in their security. Most appeared to be young, probably in their 20s, but they carried themselves with the discipline of experienced fighters. From conversations she could partially understand, Sarah gathered that they were being held in a remote location, possibly near the Pakistan border. The building had the hollow acoustics of a large, mostly empty structure, and she occasionally heard the distant sound of vehicles coming and going. This suggested they were near some kind of road or transportation route. On the 4th day, their situation took a darker turn. The guards separated Sarah from the others, dragging her to a different room where a man in expensive clothes waited with a video camera. He spoke English with a cultured accent that suggested education, making him far more dangerous than the young fighters who guarded them. "Dr. Martinez," he said, consulting a file that contained disturbing details about her background. "You are quite accomplished for someone so young. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins, specialized training in emergency medicine, volunteer work in 3 different conflict zones. Your government and your organization will pay handsomely for your safe return." Sarah remained silent, understanding that anything she said could be used against her or to harm others. The man's smile was cold as he gestured to the camera operator. "You will record a message for your family and your government. You will tell them that you are being treated well, but that time is running short for negotiations. You will ask them to meet our demands quickly before we lose patience." When Sarah refused to cooperate, the man's demeanor changed instantly. He nodded to one of the guards, who struck Sarah across the face with such force that she tasted blood. The message was clear. Cooperation was not optional. The video recording session lasted nearly an hour. Sarah was forced to read from a prepared script that contained demands for prisoner releases and ransom payments. Between takes, her captors questioned her extensively about international aid operations in Afghanistan, clearly seeking intelligence that could be used for future attacks. When they returned her to the main holding room, Sarah's fellow prisoners could see the fresh bruises on her face. She quietly shared what she had learned during her interrogation, careful to speak only when she was certain the guards couldn't hear them. "They're not just looking for money," she whispered to the others during one of their brief, unguarded moments. "They're gathering intelligence about aid operations throughout the region." This wasn't a random attack. It was planned specifically to capture international workers. David nodded grimly. "That means they'll probably try to use us to get information about other camps, other operations. We can't let them do that. Too many innocent people could be hurt." Meanwhile, unknown to the captives, an intensive search and rescue operation had been launched. The attack on the refugee camp had been reported within hours, and intelligence agencies from multiple countries were working to locate the missing aid workers. Satellite surveillance, electronic intercepts, and human intelligence networks were all being mobilized. The rescue effort was being coordinated by a joint task force that included American Special Operations Forces, British SAS, and elite units from other allied nations. Among them was Navy SEAL Team 6, whose members had extensive experience in hostage rescue operations in exactly this type of terrain and situation. Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson was leading the SEAL unit assigned to the operation. A veteran of multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, Thompson understood the challenges they faced. The kidnappers had chosen their location well. The mountainous border region provided countless hiding places and multiple escape routes into Pakistan. The intelligence picture was slowly coming together through painstaking analysis of intercepted communications, drone surveillance footage, and reports from local sources. The terrorist group responsible for the attack was known to use a network of safe houses and caves throughout the region, moving their prisoners frequently to avoid detection. Thompson and his team studied every scrap of available intelligence, building detailed maps of possible locations and planning multiple rescue scenarios. They knew that time was critical. Hostage situations like this typically had a narrow window of opportunity before the captors either moved their prisoners or, worse, decided they were more valuable dead than alive. Back in the concrete prison, Sarah noticed changes in their guards' behavior that suggested something was happening. There was more radio chatter, more coming and going of vehicles, and the guards seemed more nervous and alert. She suspected that their location might have been discovered, or at least that rescue forces were getting closer. During the night, Sarah heard sounds that confirmed her suspicions. The distant rumble of aircraft and what might have been reconnaissance drones. The guards were clearly aware of the increased activity, as they had doubled the number of people watching the prisoners and had moved additional weapons into the building. Sarah knew that if rescue forces were indeed closing in, the next few hours could be the most dangerous of their captivity. Desperate captors were unpredictable captors, and there was no telling how they might react to the pressure of an approaching rescue operation. She quietly shared her observations with the other prisoners, warning them to be ready for anything. They might need to take cover quickly if fighting broke out, or they might need to identify themselves to rescue forces in the chaos of an assault. Most importantly, they needed to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. As dawn approached, the tension in their prison was almost unbearable. Sarah could hear their guards arguing among themselves, their voices tense and urgent. Whatever was happening outside their concrete walls, it was clear that their situation was about to change dramatically. The question was whether that change would bring salvation or tragedy. The 7th day of Sarah's captivity began with an ominous change in routine. Instead of the usual morning delivery of bread and water, armed guards burst into their holding room and began shouting orders in rapid-fire Pashto. The fear in her fellow prisoners' eyes reflected Sarah's own growing terror as they were roughly pulled to their feet and marched toward the door. Sarah's legs trembled from days of inactivity and poor nutrition, but she forced herself to stay alert and observe everything around her. This was the first time they had been moved from their concrete prison, and she desperately hoped it wasn't leading to an execution. As they were pushed through a narrow corridor, She caught glimpses of the building that had held them captive. The structure was indeed an abandoned factory, probably built decades earlier, and long since stripped of any valuable equipment. Broken windows high on the walls let in streams of dusty sunlight, and the concrete floors were littered with debris and rust stains. The guards led them through a maze of empty rooms and corridors before emerging into a large loading dock area. 3 pickup trucks waited outside, their engines running and armed men positioned around the perimeter. Sarah realized with growing dread that they were being moved to a new location. In her experience with hostage situations, transfers often meant that negotiations had broken down or that the captors felt their current position was compromised. As they were loaded into the back of the middle truck, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart race. High overhead, almost invisible against the morning sky, she spotted the contrail of what looked like a surveillance aircraft. The fact that their captors were moving them so hastily suggested that rescue forces might indeed be closing in. The truck ride was a nightmare of dust, heat, and fear. Sarah and her fellow prisoners were crammed together in the truck bed, covered by a canvas tarp that blocked most of their view, but offered little protection from the blazing sun. The roads were rough mountain tracks that threw them violently from side to side with each sharp turn or pothole. During the journey, Sarah heard radio chatter from the cab of the truck. While she couldn't understand the words, the tone was urgent and worried. The convoy stopped several times and she could hear the guards talking nervously among themselves. At one point, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopters in the distance, which caused their captors to speed up considerably. After what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, the convoy finally stopped. When the canvas was pulled back, Sarah squinted against the bright sunlight and found herself looking at an entirely different type of location. Instead of the industrial building where they had been held, they were now at what appeared to be a cave complex built into the side of a rocky mountain. The caves had been modified and expanded, with concrete reinforcements and what looked like ventilation systems. This was clearly a much more sophisticated and permanent facility than their previous prison. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that rescue would be far more difficult in this remote, fortified location. The guards marched them deep into the cave system, through passages that had been carved and blasted from the living rock. Battery-powered lights strung along the walls provided dim illumination, and Sarah could feel the temperature dropping as they went deeper underground. The air was stale and carried the smell of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. Their new prison was a natural chamber that had been expanded and reinforced with concrete. Unlike their previous holding area, this space had no windows and only one entrance. Worse yet, Sarah could hear the sound of a generator somewhere nearby, suggesting that the facility had power for communications and other equipment. As the guards locked them into their new prison, Sarah noticed that their captors seemed more relaxed and confident than they had been at the factory. This underground facility was clearly their main stronghold, a place where they felt secure from outside interference. The implications for any rescue attempt were sobering. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Lieutenant Commander Thompson was studying reconnaissance photos and intelligence reports with growing frustration. The satellite surveillance had indeed located the factory where the hostages had been held, but by the time his team was in position to assault the building, thermal imaging showed it was empty. They moved them, Thompson told his team during their emergency briefing. Intelligence suggests they've been taken to one of the cave complexes near the Pakistan border. We're looking at a much more complicated rescue scenario now. The photographs spread across the planning table showed a maze of natural and artificial caves that had been used by various groups for decades. During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, these caves had sheltered Mujahideen fighters. Later, they had been used by Taliban forces and various terrorist organizations. The current occupants had clearly spent considerable time and resources fortifying their positions. "Sir, we have intercepted communications that suggest the hostages are being held in the main complex," reported Petty Officer Jackson, the team's intelligence specialist. "The bad news is that complex has multiple levels, extensive tunnel systems, and at least 3 different entrance points. The good news is that we've identified what appears to be the primary access route." Thompson studied the topographical maps and satellite images, his experienced eye picking out potential approach routes and obstacles. The cave complex was situated on a steep mountainside with clear lines of sight in all directions. Any approaching force would be visible for miles, giving the defenders ample time to prepare or eliminate the hostages. "What about the Pakistan border?" asked Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, the team's demolitions expert. "Less than 2 miles away," Thompson replied grimly. "If they get spooked, they could move the hostages across the border in minutes. Once they're in Pakistan, this becomes a whole different kind of problem." The SEAL team spent the next several hours developing multiple assault plans, each designed for different scenarios and contingencies. They studied the geological surveys of the area, analyzed the defensive positions, and calculated the timing required for each phase of a potential rescue operation. Back in the cave prison, Sarah was trying to assess their new situation while caring for her fellow prisoners. Maria's cough had worsened significantly, and she was running a fever that suggested pneumonia might be developing. David's infected arm wound was getting worse, with red streaks extending toward his shoulder that indicated blood poisoning was beginning. Without medical supplies or proper nutrition, Sarah knew that her friend's conditions would continue to deteriorate. She had tried to negotiate with the guards for basic medical care, but her requests were either ignored or met with suspicious questions about why she was so concerned about her fellow prisoners' health. The psychological pressure was becoming as dangerous as their physical conditions. The isolation, uncertainty, and constant fear were taking their toll on everyone. 2 of the other prisoners had retreated into almost catatonic states, barely responding to questions or attempts at conversation. Sarah realized that maintaining hope and fighting spirit among the group was crucial to their survival. She began organizing quiet discussions about their families, their homes, and their plans for after they were rescued. She shared stories from her medical training and previous volunteer work, anything to keep their minds active and focused on life beyond their current nightmare. During the night, Sarah heard sounds that gave her the first real hope she had felt in days. Far above their underground prison, she could hear the faint sound of aircraft engines, different from the helicopters they had heard during their transport. These sounded like the fixed-wing surveillance aircraft she had learned to recognize during her time in conflict zones. More importantly, she noticed changes in their guards' behavior. Radio communications had increased dramatically, and she could hear urgent conversations echoing through the cave passages. The guards seemed nervous and alert, frequently checking their weapons and positions. Sarah quietly shared her observations with the other prisoners who were still coherent. "I think rescue forces have found us," she whispered during one of the brief periods when no guards were visible. "We need to be ready. If fighting breaks out, stay low and identify yourselves clearly to anyone who might be friendly forces." As dawn approached somewhere far above their underground prison, Sarah could feel that their ordeal was approaching some kind of climax. The question was whether that climax would bring salvation or tragedy, and whether she and her fellow prisoners would survive long enough to find out. The 8th night of captivity brought an escalation in tension that Sarah could feel in every fiber of her being. The cave complex hummed with activity as their captors prepared for what seemed like an imminent confrontation. Guards moved through the passages with increased urgency, and the sound of weapons being checked and loaded echoed off the stone walls. Sarah huddled with her fellow prisoners in their underground cell, trying to provide what comfort she could to Maria, whose condition had deteriorated dramatically. The Spanish nurse's breathing was labored and shallow, and her fever had spiked to dangerous levels. Without antibiotics and proper medical care, Sarah feared Maria might not survive another day. David's infected arm wound had progressed to the point where red streaks were visible all the way to his shoulder. Blood poisoning was setting in, and Sarah knew that without immediate medical intervention, he too was facing a life-threatening situation. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was a skilled emergency physician, trapped with patients who desperately needed care, but completely unable to help them. Around midnight, the normal pattern of guard rotations changed. Instead of the usual 2 guards stationed outside their cell, Sarah counted at least 6 different voices in the corridor beyond their door. The radio chatter had increased to an almost constant stream, and she could hear vehicles moving somewhere above them in the main cave entrance. Then, at approximately 2 in the morning, everything changed. The first explosion was so powerful that it shook dust and small rocks from the ceiling of their prison cell. Sarah threw herself over Maria to protect her from the falling debris, while the other prisoners pressed themselves against the walls in terror. The sound echoed through the cave system like thunder, followed immediately by the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire. "This is it," Sarah whispered urgently to the others. "Stay down, stay together, and be ready to identify yourselves if anyone reaches us." The battle for the cave complex had begun in earnest. From the sounds reaching their underground prison, Sarah could tell that the fighting was intense and happening on multiple levels. Explosions echoed through the stone corridors, punctuated by bursts of gunfire and the shouts of men in combat. Lieutenant Commander Thompson and his SEAL team had spent 2 days planning their assault on the cave complex. Using intelligence gathered from drone surveillance, intercepted communications, and reconnaissance by local assets, they had identified the most likely location of the hostages and planned a multi-pronged attack designed to overwhelm the defenders before they could harm their prisoners. The assault began with a diversionary attack on the main entrance to the cave complex. A team of rangers engaged the defensive positions there, drawing the attention and resources of the terrorist guards. While the defenders focused on repelling this obvious threat, Thompson's SEAL team approached the complex from an unexpected direction. Using specialized climbing equipment, the SEALs had scaled the rocky mountainside during the darkest hours of the night, approaching the cave system from above, through a series of natural fissures and crevices that the defenders had assumed were impassable. It was dangerous, technically challenging, work that required both exceptional physical conditioning and nerves of steel. Thompson led his team through a narrow crack in the mountainside that opened into the upper levels of the cave system. Moving in complete silence, they navigated through passages that had been carved by centuries of water erosion, using night vision equipment to avoid detection by the terrorist guards. The initial phase of their infiltration went perfectly. They eliminated 3 guard posts without raising an alarm, moving deeper into the complex while the defenders' attention remained focused on the diversionary attack at the main entrance. Thompson's years of experience in similar operations told him that they had perhaps 15 minutes before the terrorists realized they were being attacked from multiple directions. Back in the underground prison, Sarah could tell that the fighting was getting closer. The explosions were louder now, and she could hear the distinctive sound of flashbang grenades and other specialized equipment that suggested professional military forces were involved in the assault. "Sarah," Maria whispered weakly, grasping her hand with fevered fingers. "If we don't make it out of here, I want you to know that working with you has been an honor. You've given us hope when everything seemed hopeless." "We're going to make it," Sarah replied firmly, though her own doubts were growing as the sounds of battle intensified. "Help is here. We just need to hang on a little longer." The terrorist guards who had been watching their cell had disappeared, presumably called to defensive positions elsewhere in the complex. For the first time in over a week, Sarah and her fellow prisoners were completely alone. She tested the door to their cell and found it still securely locked. But the absence of guards gave her a spark of hope. Thompson's team had reached the level where intelligence suggested the hostages were being held. Moving through passages lit only by their night vision equipment, they systematically cleared each chamber and corridor. The map they had created from drone surveillance and electronic intercepts was proving accurate. But the complex was larger and more maze-like than they had anticipated. At 2:47 hours, Thompson heard something that made him signal for his team to freeze in place. Through the stone walls and over the sound of distant gunfire, he could hear voices speaking English. Faint, muffled, but definitely English. After days of searching and planning, they had found their target. The SEAL team moved with lethal precision toward the source of the voices. Using hand signals perfected through years of training and combat experience, Thompson positioned his men around what appeared to be a reinforced door set into the natural rock wall of the cave. Electronic surveillance equipment confirmed the presence of multiple people behind the barrier. In their underground prison, Sarah heard new sounds that made her heart race with hope. Footsteps in the corridor outside, but moving with a different rhythm and purpose than their terrorist guards. These steps were measured, professional, suggesting military training, rather than the casual movement of the men who had held them captive. Then she heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, someone speaking English with an American accent. "This is SEAL Team 6, came a voice through the stone wall. "Are there American hostages in there?" Sarah's voice caught in her throat for a moment before she managed to respond. "Yes, we're here. There are 6 of us, all aid workers. We have wounded people who need immediate medical attention." Thompson smiled grimly as he heard the response. After 8 days of captivity, the hostages were alive and responsive. Now came the most dangerous part of the operation, getting them out safely while the complex was still under attack from defending terrorists. "Stand clear of the door," Thompson called out. "We're going to breach it. Stay low and identify yourselves clearly when we come through." Sarah gathered her fellow prisoners against the far wall of their cell, shielding Maria and David as best she could. The sound of the breaching charge being prepared was followed by a sharp command to take cover. The explosion that blew open their prison door was controlled and precise, but in the confined space of their cell it was still deafening. Smoke and dust filled the air as dark figures moved through the opening, their weapons raised and ready for combat. "American aid workers," Sarah called out immediately, her hands raised to show she was not a threat. "We're American aid workers. We need medical help for our wounded." Thompson's flashlight beam cut through the smoke and dust, illuminating 6 figures huddled against the far wall of the cave chamber. After more than a week of captivity, they looked exhausted, injured, and malnourished, but they were alive. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Thompson, Navy SEALs," he said, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos of the ongoing battle. "We're here to get you out." "Can everyone walk?" Sarah quickly assessed her fellow prisoners. 2 of them are in bad shape medically, but I think we can get them moving with support. "I'm a doctor. I can help with medical decisions during the evacuation." Thompson nodded, already coordinating with his team and the command center through his radio. The hardest part of their mission, finding and reaching the hostages, was complete. Now they had to get 6 exhausted, injured civilians out of a cave complex that was still swarming with armed terrorists, determined to prevent exactly that outcome. The rescue had only just begun. Thompson quickly assessed the condition of the hostages while his team maintained security around their position. The sound of gunfire echoed through the cave passages, a constant reminder that they were still deep in enemy territory with a long, dangerous journey ahead of them. Sarah's medical training proved invaluable as she helped Thompson's medic evaluate Maria and David. Both were in critical condition and would require immediate medical attention once they reached safety. Maria's pneumonia had progressed to the point where her breathing was severely compromised, while David's blood poisoning was causing dangerous fluctuations in his heart rate and blood pressure. "Doc, we need to move now," Thompson told Sarah, using his radio to coordinate with the other elements of the rescue operation. "The diversionary attack won't hold their attention much longer, and we've got about a 10-minute window to get out of here before they realize what's happening." Thompson's team had prepared for exactly this scenario. 2 of his SEALs immediately took responsibility for supporting Maria and David, while the other hostages were assigned to different team members. Sarah insisted on staying close to her patients, her medical expertise potentially crucial if their conditions deteriorated during the evacuation. The journey through the cave complex was a nightmare of narrow passages, steep climbs, and constant vigilance against terrorist fighters who might appear around any corner. Thompson led the way using night vision equipment, while his team members guided the exhausted hostages through passages that required crawling, climbing, and squeezing through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. Maria lost consciousness twice during the first 20 minutes of their escape, her weakened body unable to cope with the physical demands of the evacuation. Each time, Sarah and the SEAL medic had to stop and stabilize her condition before continuing. The delays were dangerous as radio chatter indicated that the terrorists were beginning to realize that the main attack was a diversion. "Sir, we've got movement in the lower tunnels," reported Petty Officer Jackson through Thompson's earpiece. "Looks like they're starting to search for the hostages. We need to move faster." But moving faster wasn't an option with 2 critically ill patients who needed constant medical attention. Sarah found herself making life and death decisions in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced emergency physician. With no equipment beyond basic first aid supplies, she had to rely on her knowledge and instincts to keep Maria and David alive. The route Thompson had chosen led them through some of the most difficult terrain in the cave system, but it had the advantage of being unexpected and defensible. The narrow passages would prevent the terrorists from using their superior numbers, while the SEALs' training and equipment gave them a significant advantage in close-quarters combat. About halfway through their escape route, they encountered their first serious resistance. A group of 3 terrorist fighters had positioned themselves in a chamber that the rescue team needed to pass through. Thompson made a split-second decision to assault the position, rather than try to find an alternate route that might take hours they didn't have. "Stay down and stay quiet. Thompson whispered to Sarah and the other hostages. "This is going to get loud." The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but in the confined space of the cave chamber, it was incredibly intense. Thompson's team moved with the precision that came from years of training and combat experience, using coordinated movements and specialized equipment to overwhelm the defenders before they could effectively respond. When the shooting stopped, 3 terrorists were dead, and Thompson's team had suffered only minor injuries. But the gunfire had certainly alerted other defenders to their presence, and Sarah could hear shouts and movement echoing through the cave passages around them. "That's blown our stealth advantage," Thompson said grimly, as his team prepared to move again. "From here on out, it's going to be a running fight to the extraction point." The next phase of their escape became a desperate race through increasingly difficult terrain while under sporadic fire from pursuing terrorists. Sarah found herself half-carrying Maria through passages that required them to crawl on their hands and knees, while David leaned heavily on one of the seals for support. The physical demands were enormous, but Sarah drew strength from the knowledge that freedom was getting closer with each step. Thompson's calm professionalism and his team's obvious competence gave her confidence that they would make it out alive, despite the growing sounds of pursuit behind them. As they climbed through a particularly challenging section of the cave system, Sarah heard something that made her heart soar: the sound of helicopters overhead. The extraction team was in position, waiting for them to reach the pickup point that Thompson had designated during the mission planning. But reaching that pickup point required climbing nearly 200 feet through a natural chimney in the rock that led to the surface. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging technical climb. With exhausted, injured hostages and armed pursuers closing in, it seemed almost impossible. Thompson's team had prepared for this challenge as well. They quickly rigged a system of ropes and pulleys that would allow them to lift the hostages to the surface, while team members positioned themselves to provide covering fire against any terrorist who might follow them up the chimney. Sarah went up first, along with one of the SEALs who would help coordinate the evacuation once they reached the surface. The climb was terrifying, especially in the darkness, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the rope above her and the knowledge that Maria and David were depending on her to help get them to safety. When she finally emerged from the cave system onto the rocky mountainside, Sarah was overwhelmed by the sight of the night sky after more than a week underground. The stars had never looked so beautiful, and the cold mountain air felt like the sweetest thing she had ever breathed. The extraction site was a whirlwind of organized activity. Medical teams were standing by with equipment that could stabilize Maria and David for transport to a military hospital. Communication specialists were coordinating with multiple aircraft and ground units to ensure the area remained secure during the evacuation. One by one, the other hostages were pulled up from the cave system. Maria required immediate medical intervention, with the flight medics working to stabilize her breathing and circulation before loading her onto the helicopter. David was conscious but weak, his infected arm requiring immediate antibiotic treatment to prevent systemic collapse. Thompson was the last to emerge from the cave system, ensuring that all of his team and all of the hostages were safely out before abandoning their position. As he reached the surface, explosions echoed from deep within the cave complex as his demolitions expert triggered charges designed to seal the passages and prevent pursuit. "That's everyone," Thompson reported to the extraction coordinator. 6 hostages recovered, all alive. 2 require immediate medical evacuation. Sarah found herself aboard a military helicopter, finally safe after 8 days that had felt like a lifetime. As the aircraft lifted off from the mountainside, she looked down at the cave complex that had been their prison. Smoke was rising from several openings in the rock, evidence of the battle that had secured their freedom. Sitting beside Maria's stretcher as the flight medics worked to stabilize her condition, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary courage and skill of the men who had risked their lives to save them. Thompson and his team had performed what seemed like an impossible mission, penetrating deep into enemy territory to rescue 6 people they had never met. The helicopter banked sharply as it headed toward the military hospital where proper medical care awaited. Sarah held Maria's hand and whispered reassurances, promising her that they were finally safe and that everything was going to be all right. For the first time in over a week, Sarah allowed herself to believe that promise was true. The military hospital at Bagram Air Base was a stark contrast to the cave prison where Sarah had spent the previous 8 days. Clean white walls, sophisticated medical equipment, and the bustling efficiency of trained military medical personnel created an environment where healing could finally begin. Sarah refused treatment for her own injuries until she had ensured that Maria and David were receiving the care they desperately needed. Her medical training made her invaluable to the hospital staff, who welcomed her insights into her fellow hostages, conditions, and the treatments they had missed during their captivity. Maria was immediately placed on a ventilator to assist her breathing while powerful antibiotics fought the pneumonia that had nearly killed her. The infection had progressed further than Sarah had realized, and the military doctors told her privately that Maria might not have survived another day without proper medical intervention. David's infected arm wound required emergency surgery to clean out the infection and remove damaged tissue. The blood poisoning had been caught just in time, but he would need weeks of intensive antibiotic treatment to fully recover. Sarah stayed with him during the surgery, providing emotional support and helping to communicate his medical history to the surgical team. The other 4 hostages were in better physical condition, but all showed signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. The hospital's mental health specialist began working with them immediately, understanding that the emotional wounds from their ordeal might take longer to heal than their physical injuries. For Sarah, the transition from captivity to freedom was surreal. Simple things like hot food, clean water, and a comfortable bed felt almost overwhelming after days of deprivation. But more than the physical comforts, it was the knowledge that she was truly safe that allowed her to finally begin processing what they had all endured. Lieutenant Commander Thompson visited the hospital the day after the rescue, still wearing his combat gear and showing the exhaustion that came from a successful but demanding mission. Sarah insisted on meeting with him personally to express her gratitude for what he and his team had accomplished. "Doctor, you and your team showed incredible courage during that rescue," Thompson told her as they sat in the hospital's family waiting area. "Your medical knowledge and leadership helped keep everyone alive until we could reach you." Sarah shook her head, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what the SEALs had done. "Commander, you and your men risked your lives to save people you'd never met. That cave complex was a fortress and you got all 6 of us out alive. I don't know how to thank you for that." Thompson's response was simple and profound. "Ma'am, that's what we do. When Americans are in trouble overseas, we come get them. No matter where they are, no matter how dangerous it is. That's a promise our country makes to people like you who volunteer to help others in dangerous places." Over the following days, Sarah learned more about the extensive operation that had led to their rescue. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries had worked around the clock to locate them, while diplomatic channels had been used to pressure the Pakistani government to allow the rescue operation near their border. The terrorist organization that had captured them was part of a larger network that had been planning similar attacks throughout the region. The intelligence gathered from the cave complex during the rescue operation had led to additional raids that disrupted their operations and prevented future attacks on aid workers and refugees. Sarah also learned that her family back in Texas had been informed of the situation within hours of the initial attack. Her parents had maintained a constant vigil, working with State Department officials and advocacy groups to keep pressure on the government to find and rescue their daughter and her colleagues. The phone call home was emotional beyond anything Sarah had ever experienced. Hearing her mother's voice for the first time in over a week, knowing that she was safe and would soon be coming home, reduced her to tears of relief and joy. Her father, a retired Army officer himself, expressed his pride both in her courage during the ordeal and in the professionalism of the military personnel who had rescued her. As the days passed and her physical strength returned, Sarah found herself grappling with the psychological impact of her captivity. The nightmares, the moments of sudden fear when she heard unexpected noises, the difficulty concentrating on simple tasks, all were normal responses to traumatic stress, according to the military psychiatrists who worked with her. But Sarah also discovered something else within herself, an even deeper commitment to the humanitarian work that had brought her to Afghanistan in the first place. The attack on the refugee camp and her subsequent captivity had been intended to discourage international aid workers from helping vulnerable populations. Instead, It had strengthened her resolve to continue serving those who needed help most. Maria's recovery was slower but steady. The pneumonia had damaged her lungs significantly, and she would need months of rehabilitation before returning to full health. But her spirit remained strong, and she spoke frequently about her plans to return to humanitarian work once she was physically able. David's infected arm healed well with proper medical treatment, though he would carry scars from both the original wound and the surgical repair. Like Sarah and Maria, he was determined not to let the experience end his career in international aid work. 3 weeks after the rescue, Sarah was declared fit for travel and prepared to return to the United States. The other hostages were also ready to go home, though Maria would continue her recovery at a military medical facility in Germany before returning to Spain. Lieutenant Commander Thompson and several members of his team came to see them off at the airfield. The bonds forged during those terrifying hours in the cave complex had created connections that Sarah knew would last for the rest of her life. "Promise me something, Doc," Thompson said as they prepared to board the transport aircraft. "Don't let what happened to you stop you from doing the work you came here to do. The world needs people like you, people willing to help others even when it's dangerous." Sarah nodded, knowing that she had already made that decision. "I promise, Commander, and I promise that I'll never forget what you and your team did for us. Heroes really don't quit, do they?" Thompson smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Sarah had seen from him. "No, ma'am, they don't. And neither do the people worth saving." As the aircraft lifted off from Afghanistan, carrying her toward home and family in safety, Sarah looked out the window at the rugged landscape below. Somewhere down there, refugee families were still struggling to survive in camps like the one where she had been captured. Aid workers were still risking their lives to provide medical care, clean water, and hope to people who had lost everything. The terrorists who had tried to break her spirit through captivity and fear had failed completely. If anything, her ordeal had shown her just how much good people were willing to sacrifice for others. From the refugee families who had tried to help during the attack, to the intelligence analysts who had worked tirelessly to find them, to the SEALs who had risked everything in the rescue operation, Sarah had witnessed humanity at its very best. She closed her eyes and settled back in her seat, already planning her return to humanitarian work. The world was full of dangerous places where people needed help, and full of heroes ready to provide it. Sarah Martinez was proud to count herself among both groups, and she knew that neither captivity nor fear would ever change that fundamental truth about who she was and what she was called to do.